I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I never thought they'd go this far. When I left for work that morning, everything was normal. But when I came home, my own street was blocked off, thick chains strung across the road and massive concrete blocks sitting right in the middle of the pavement. I slammed my truck into park and stepped out, jaw tight with frustration. A few of my neighbors stood around, shaking their heads in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" I asked, pointing at the barricade. An older man, Mr. Calloway, sighed. "HOA did it. Said this road is private property now and only HOA-approved vehicles can pass." I let out a sharp laugh. "You're kidding me." Before anyone could respond, I heard the familiar click-clack of heels on pavement. And there she was, Patricia Langley, the HOA president, looking smug as ever in her ridiculous pastel blazer and oversized sunglasses. "Jonathan, I assume you're confused," she said, folding her arms like she had any real authority. "Confused? No, Patricia. I'm pissed," I shot back. "You can't just block a public road." She gave me a condescending smile. "Oh, but we can. The HOA has determined that this road is being misused by non-residents, and we have the right to control access. We sent out notices weeks ago." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Patricia, I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but this is illegal." Her smile didn't waver. "You're welcome to take it up with the county, but I assure you, we've done everything by the book." I clenched my fists. "You really think you can just do whatever you want, huh?" She adjusted her sunglasses. "Jonathan, you've always been so dramatic. If you want access, you can apply for an HOA-approved pass. It's only $50 a month." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you're out of your damn mind." She shrugged. "Rules are rules. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the board." I watched her walk away, my blood boiling. This wasn't just HOA overreach, this was extortion. And Patricia thought she held all the cards. She had no idea who she was messing with. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I rarely used. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need you to come down here. The HOA just blocked off our road with chains and concrete." There was a pause. Then, in that no-nonsense tone I'd grown up with, my father asked, "They did what?" The moment I hung up the phone, I could already hear the irritation in my father's voice replaying in my head. He wasn't a man who tolerated nonsense, and the fact that the HOA thought they could just blockade a road without legal authority was exactly the kind of nonsense that would set him off. Around me, my neighbors were still standing in small clusters, muttering amongst themselves, but there was a shift in the air, a sense that something bigger was about to unfold. They had seen me make the call, and given that my father had been the police chief for over 20 years, most of them knew exactly who I had just summoned. I paced near my truck, jaw tight, as I waited. It didn't take long. Less than 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the barricade, and out stepped my father, Chief Mark Grayson. He wasn't in uniform, he'd been off duty, but the way he moved, the way his presence commanded attention, made it clear he was still every bit the authority figure. His sharp eyes swept over the chains and concrete blocks, then over the gathering of residents. He exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, the way he always did when he was trying to keep from immediately tearing someone apart. He walked up to me, his voice low and steady. "Tell me everything." I didn't waste time. I explained how the HOA had decided, without any real authority, to block off the road. How they were now charging residents for access passes. How Patricia Langley had been smug about the whole thing, acting like she was untouchable. My father's expression didn't change as he listened, but I knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his eyes. When I finished, he nodded once, then turned to the nearest neighbor, Mr. Calloway. "How many people got these so-called notices?" Mr. Calloway shook his head. "I sure didn't. And I've lived here longer than the HOAs even existed." Others around us murmured their agreement. Dad's lips pressed into a thin line. "So they're making up rules and enforcing them without actually notifying residents?" A woman named Lisa stepped forward. "They've been pulling this kind of thing for years, harassing people with fines, threatening liens. But this is the worst they've ever done." My father nodded again, then turned to me. "Stay here." He walked straight towards the HOA office, which was housed in a small, overly pretentious building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Patricia must have seen him coming, because by the time he reached the door, she was already stepping outside, her usual arrogance on full display. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with fake politeness. My father didn't bother with pleasantries. You're the HOA president? She lifted her chin. I am. He pointed toward the barricade. Remove it. Now. Patricia scoffed, shaking her head. I don't believe you understand, sir. The HOA has full authority over. My father cut her off, his voice dangerously calm. No, you don't. That road is county property, which means you have no legal right to block it. You're unlawfully restricting access to public infrastructure, and unless you want your entire HOA board to be slapped with criminal charges, you'll remove those barriers immediately. Patricia's lips pursed, but she didn't back down. We consulted with legal counsel before taking any action. Everything we've done is within our rights. My father let out a dry chuckle. Is that so? Then I'm sure you won't mind handing over the official documentation proving the HOA has jurisdiction over the road. Patricia hesitated. It's not with me at the moment. My father's expression darkened. That's what I thought. He turned slightly, waving over an officer who had just arrived on scene. Get in touch with county records. I want confirmation on whether this road belongs to the HOA or if it's still under municipal jurisdiction. Patricia's confidence wavered. She opened her mouth, but my father wasn't done. And in the meantime, I'm filing an official complaint for obstruction of public property. If those barriers aren't gone in the next 30 minutes, I will personally make sure every member of this board is investigated for misuse of funds and abuse of authority. For the first time, Patricia looked nervous. There's no need for that, she said quickly. I'll have the barriers removed. My father gave her a long, hard stare. You have 20 minutes. Patricia turned on her heel and stormed back inside. Moments later, a handful of HOA lackeys emerged, looking less than thrilled as they started unbolting the chains and moving the concrete blocks. As soon as the last piece of obstruction was gone, my father turned back to me, his expression satisfied. That's one problem handled. But I'm not done yet. I knew exactly what he meant. The HOA had overstepped for too long, and now they were about to face real consequences. With the barricade gone, the tension in the neighborhood didn't disappear, it shifted. The residents, who had always grumbled about the HOA's overreach in private, were now openly discussing just how far this had gone. My father stood beside me, arms crossed, watching as the last chain was hauled away. Patricia had retreated back into the HOA office, likely trying to figure out how much damage control she needed to do. I knew better than to think she would back down completely. People like Patricia didn't give up. When they were cornered, they regrouped and came back even worse. Lisa, the neighbor who had spoken up earlier, stepped up to us. Mark, I know you just solved the immediate problem, but this isn't going to stop. They've been bleeding us dry for years, and now they're trying to take control of the roads? They'll come up with another way to sink their claws into us. My father nodded. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Which is why we're not stopping here. I turned to him, already knowing he had a plan. What's next? He glanced toward the HOA office, his expression unreadable. We're going to make sure this never happens again. But first, we need to figure out exactly how deep this mess goes. I knew what that meant. We needed records, paper trails, proof that the HOA had been overstepping their authority beyond just today's stunt. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. If you're looking for evidence, I've got years' worth of notices and fines they've sent me. Half of them were bogus, but they always threatened legal action if I didn't pay up. Lisa nodded. Same here. I've got folders full of their ridiculous fees. They once fined me $200 because my mailbox wasn't aesthetically cohesive with the neighborhood. And don't even get me started on the time they tried to tell me I needed to get their approval to plant flowers in my own yard. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply. All right, so we gather everything, every fine, every notice, every ridiculous rule they've forced on people. The more proof we have, the better. My father's eyes darkened. And once we have it, we take it to the county board. If they've been stepping outside their legal boundaries, we'll make sure they answer for it. Lisa folded her arms. You think the county will actually do something? Seems like these HOA types get away with everything. My father's voice was steady. Not if we hit them with enough evidence. And not if we make enough noise. That was the key. We couldn't just go through quiet, bureaucratic channels. This needed to be public. Loud. I turned to the neighbors around us. How many of you are willing to fight this? To make sure they can't keep pulling this crap? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People were tired, angry, ready to push back. Lisa lifted her chin. You tell us what needs to be done, and we'll do it. My father nodded. Good. Start gathering everything you have. Every document, every complaint. Make copies and bring them to my house tomorrow evening. We'll go through everything and build a case. Mr. Calloway adjusted his glasses. And what about Patricia and the board? You think they're just going to sit back and let us dig up dirt on them? I let out a dry laugh. Not a chance. But that's why we're going to make sure they don't see us coming. The meeting was set. Tomorrow night, we'd go through every scrap of evidence the HOA had ever thrown at the neighborhood. And when we were ready, we'd hit them with something they couldn't ignore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, going through my own paperwork. Fines I had paid just to avoid the hassle. Letters demanding maintenance on things that weren't even broken. Then, something caught my eye. A financial breakdown from a few years back. The HOA had increased dues for road maintenance, yet the roads had never been repaved. No new work had been done. I frowned, flipping through more documents. The numbers didn't add up. My father walked in, setting a cup of coffee on the table. Find something? I pushed the papers toward him. Look at this. They raised fees for maintenance, but none of the money ever seemed to go toward actual repairs. He scanned the pages, his frown deepening. If they've been misusing funds, that's not just shady, that's illegal. A slow grin spread across my face. Then we might have something bigger than just overstepping authority. My father nodded. Tomorrow night, we bring this up. If they've been misusing HOA funds, they won't just be facing angry homeowners, they'll be facing criminal charges. This fight had started with a blocked road. Now, it was turning into something much bigger, and Patricia Langley had no idea what was coming for her. The next evening, my living room was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, while others stood near the walls, holding stacks of papers, folders, and old HOA notices. There was an energy in the air, a mix of frustration and determination. People were ready to fight back. My father stood at the front of the room, flipping through a manila folder. He had spent the entire day gathering county records, financial reports, and legal documents. When he finally looked up, the room quieted. He wasted no time. Let's get to work. Lisa stepped forward first, setting a thick folder on the coffee table. She pulled out a few sheets and pointed to them. These are all the fines I've received over the last 5 years. Some were for things that weren't even in the HOA guidelines. They fined me for excessive outdoor decorations when I only had a single wreath on my door. And when I asked them to show me where that rule was written, they ignored me. Mr. Calloway added his own stack to the pile. They charged me for lawn negligence in the middle of winter when my grass was covered in snow. I fought it, but they kept tacking on late fees until I just gave up and paid. More neighbors followed, each with their own stories of fabricated fines, arbitrary rule changes, and escalating fees. My father listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. When everyone had finished, he set his pen down and looked at me. Tell them what you found. I grabbed the financial reports I had uncovered the night before and held them up. This is where things get serious. The HOA raised fees for road maintenance, but there's no record of that money actually being used for repairs. In fact, I checked county work orders. No permits were ever pulled for road work in the last 10 years. A murmur spread through the crowd. Lisa's eyes narrowed. So where did the money go? My father answered before I could. That's what we're going to find out. But if they've been redirecting funds for personal use, that's not just unethical, it's criminal. A man named Robert, who had mostly stayed quiet until now, leaned forward. I used to work in accounting. If we can get our hands on their financial statements, I can go through them and see if anything stands out. Lisa nodded. I know someone who works at the county office. She might be able to pull records on any filings Patricia and her board have submitted. Mr. Calloway tapped a finger against the table. If they've been embezzling, we need to hit them hard. Publicly. My father nodded. That's the plan. But before we go public, we need undeniable proof. The meeting continued late into the night, with everyone organizing their evidence. By the time people started heading home, we had a game plan. The next morning, Lisa's contact at the county office came through. She sent over a scan of the HOA's latest financial disclosure form. Robert went through it line by line, muttering under his breath. Finally, he let out a low whistle. This is bad. I leaned over his shoulder. How bad? He pointed to a section labeled Community Improvement Fund. They've been funneling money here, but there's no breakdown of how it's being spent. It's just listed as a lump sum expense. Lisa frowned. So they could be using it for anything? Robert nodded. And since it's not itemized, it's impossible to trace without a deeper audit. But here's the real issue: they've been increasing dues every year, citing rising maintenance costs. Yet, their reported expenses have barely changed. That means they're collecting more but not spending it on what they claim. My father folded his arms. That's fraud. I grabbed my phone. Time to make this public. Lisa grinned. I'll draft a statement for the local news. They love exposing corruption. Robert tapped the papers again. We should also request a forensic audit. If they've been lining their own pockets, that'll expose everything. Mr. Calloway leaned back in his chair. I'd love to see Patricia try to talk her way out of that. By midday, we had submitted an official complaint to the county and sent the evidence to a local journalist. Within hours, the story was live. HOA accused of financial misconduct. Residents demand investigation. The fallout was immediate. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before started coming forward, sharing their own experiences. The HOA board tried to control the narrative, but the evidence was overwhelming. 2 days later, county auditors arrived at the HOA office, demanding access to financial records. Cameras from the local news station captured Patricia's pale face as she tried to explain why certain records were missing. By the end of the week, the county announced a full investigation into the HOA's finances. Patricia and the board were officially suspended pending the results. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. For the first time in years, people felt hopeful. As I stood on my porch that evening, my father joined me. He looked out at the now unblocked road, then turned to me. You did good, son. I grinned. We did good. The HOA had tried to control us, but in the end, they had only doomed themselves. And this time, there was no coming back for them. As the investigation into the HOA's finances gained momentum, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People who had once stayed silent out of fear were now openly discussing everything the board had done over the years. Patricia Langley, once untouchable, had become a walking scandal. The county's forensic audit was in full swing, and rumors spread about missing receipts, unauthorized withdrawals, and suspicious transactions. Patricia had vanished from public view, refusing to answer questions, but the other board members weren't as disciplined. A few of them had started pointing fingers at each other, scrambling to shift blame before the investigation reached its peak. One evening, as I was locking up my garage, my father pulled into my driveway. He stepped out of his car, a thick folder in hand, his expression unreadable. The weight of whatever was inside those documents told me we were about to take things to another level. He handed me the folder without a word. I opened it and scanned the first few pages. What I saw made my stomach tighten. It was worse than we thought. The HOA hadn't just been collecting extra dues under false pretenses. Patricia and a select few board members had been funneling money into private accounts, labeling the transactions as consulting fees and administrative costs. But there was no record of any actual consulting work. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away over the years. They had treated the HOA like a personal bank, and for the first time, we had the hard proof to bring them down. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. This isn't just fraud. This is theft. My father nodded. And now we have enough to make sure they don't just step down, they'll be facing criminal charges. We had already sent the initial evidence to the county, but this needed to go straight to the district attorney. That night, we met with the residents again. This time, the energy was different. It wasn't just about taking back control of the neighborhood. It was about making sure Patricia and her cronies paid for what they had done. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. This isn't just about bad leadership. They need to be held accountable legally. Robert, who had been combing through financial records for days, tapped the table. I cross-checked everything. Some of these transactions don't even make sense. They were moving money in circles, trying to cover their tracks, but they got sloppy. Mr. Calloway adjusted his glasses. So what's our next move? My father placed a single page on the table. We take this to the DA's office first thing in the morning, and we make sure the media gets a copy too. Lisa grinned. That'll be the final nail in the coffin. The neighborhood had suffered under Patricia's rule for too long. Now, the reckoning was here. The next morning, we drove downtown, evidence in hand. The DA's office took the complaint seriously, especially given the amount of money involved. By the end of the day, an official investigation had been launched. 2 days later, the news broke. Local headlines splashed across every screen. HOA board under criminal investigation for embezzlement. The fallout was immediate. Patricia's house, once a pristine display of superiority, had reporters swarming around it. The remaining board members resigned within hours, desperate to escape the sinking ship. But it was too late. The county's investigation had already uncovered enough to freeze the HOA's accounts, ensuring no more money could be drained. Some board members tried to claim ignorance, but with their signatures on financial documents, they weren't getting off that easy. By the end of the week, Patricia was officially charged with fraud and misappropriation of funds. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now openly rejoicing. The HOA, which had ruled through intimidation and deceit, had finally crumbled. As I stood on my porch, watching the street that had once been blocked by chains and concrete, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: relief. My father stepped up beside me, hands in his pockets. "This is what happens when people push back," he said. I nodded. "And when they have the right people fighting for them." The HOA had tried to take control, but in the end, they had destroyed themselves. And this time, there was no coming back. The neighborhood had changed almost overnight. With Patricia and the HOA board facing criminal charges, the once oppressive atmosphere had lifted. People no longer whispered in fear of retaliation. They spoke openly, sharing years of pent-up frustration. Front yards that had been meticulously controlled by arbitrary rules suddenly flourished with decorations, gardens, and even the occasional lawn ornament that would have once resulted in a fine. But the fight wasn't over yet. Though the board had been dismantled, the HOA itself still existed, and its finances were in complete disarray. The county had frozen the accounts pending the fraud investigation, but without leadership, there was no one in charge of deciding what came next. A meeting was called in the community center, the first one in years that wasn't orchestrated by Patricia's iron grip. Residents filled the room, some wary, others hopeful. My father and I stood near the back, watching as Lisa took charge at the front, a clipboard in hand and determination in her eyes. She wasted no time. The moment the room quieted, she laid out the facts. The HOA was effectively leaderless. The remaining funds were being scrutinized by the county, and until a decision was made about its future, everything was at a standstill. The big question: should the HOA be dissolved entirely or rebuilt under new leadership? Robert, the former accountant who had helped expose the financial misconduct, was the first to speak. He pointed out the dangers of letting things remain in limbo. If they didn't take control, the county might appoint an external management company, and those were often worse than corrupt HOA boards. They operated purely for profit, with little regard for the residents. Mr. Calloway, always the voice of experience, argued that the community had survived just fine before the HOA's existence. He wanted it gone, believing that no amount of reform could prevent another power-hungry board from taking over in the future. The debate grew heated. Some feared losing the HOA would lead to deteriorating property values, while others insisted they'd rather take that risk than deal with another Patricia. As voices rose, my father stepped forward, his presence enough to command silence. He didn't take sides but reminded everyone that the choice was theirs. If they wanted to disband the HOA, they needed a formal petition with majority approval. If they wanted to rebuild, they had to elect a temporary leadership team and immediately address the financial chaos. Lisa saw the opportunity and seized it. She proposed an immediate vote. 2 sheets of paper were set up at the front, one for keeping the HOA with a new board, and one for dissolving it entirely. One by one, residents came forward, casting their votes. The tension in the room was palpable as the last ballot was placed. Robert and Lisa tallied the results in silence. When they turned around, the verdict was clear. The neighborhood had voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the HOA. A murmur ran through the crowd, then cheers erupted. Decades of frustration had finally come to an end. No more arbitrary fines, no more power-hungry board members controlling their lives. The HOA was officially dead. But one problem remained: the frozen funds. Without an official HOA board, no one could access the money that had been collected from the residents over the years. Patricia and her cronies had drained a significant amount, but there was still a sizable sum left. The question was, what would happen to it? Lisa spoke with the county officials, who confirmed that since the HOA was legally dissolved, the remaining funds couldn't just disappear. They had to be either returned to the residents or allocated toward community improvements. A final meeting was scheduled to decide how to distribute the money. This time, the mood was celebratory. People laughed and spoke freely as they gathered. The vote was straightforward. return the funds as refunds to current homeowners, or use them for much-needed repairs and upgrades, like repaving the roads Patricia had claimed to maintain. The decision was nearly unanimous. The money would be used to fix the very infrastructure the HOA had neglected. It was poetic justice. The funds Patricia had stolen under the guise of maintenance fees would finally go toward the purpose she had falsely claimed. Construction crews were hired, and within weeks, the roads were being repaved. Sidewalks that had cracked from years of neglect were repaired. The neighborhood, once stifled by oppressive rules and greed, was finally free to flourish on its own terms. As I stood on my newly paved street, watching kids ride bikes without worrying about potholes, my father walked up beside me. He glanced around, taking in the changes. "Looks like they're finally getting what they paid for." I nodded, and without anyone breathing down their necks about mailbox colors. He chuckled, shaking his head. "People like Patricia thrive on power until someone stands up to them. You did good, son." I looked around at the neighborhood, at the people who had once been afraid to speak out now laughing and talking freely. It wasn't just about winning against Patricia. It was about proving that communities didn't need power-hungry overlords to function. The HOA was gone. The neighborhood was stronger. And for the first time in years, people were truly free.